Robin, you're recording?
Yep.
Okay, we will call the December 10th, 2020 Newberg Planning Commission meeting to order. Can we get a roll call, please?
Yes, Jason Dale,
Here.
Robert Sherry,
Here.
Robert Ficker,
Here.
Chris Wright, Sharon Capri,
Here.
Jeffrey Musall,
Here.
Colin Bullock,
Chris Wright just came in. Hold on.
okay.
I think Colin was a couple minutes late last month too. It's all right.
Okay, Chris,
Okay. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
there we go.
Yes.
Thank you,
Yes,
Chris.
we can.
Gotcha.
Yay.
Okay. Thank you very much. At this point, we'd like to open the public record for anything that is not on the agenda tonight. Do we have anybody that fits that description? Hearing none, we'll move on to the consent calendar for last month's meeting. Do I have any motions before me regarding that? Or comments?
PC Wright moves to approve the November 12th, 2020 PC meeting minutes.
Okay, I have a motion. Do I have a second?
We'll second that.
Was that Commissioner Sherry seconding?
Yes.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. We'll get a voice vote. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Any nays, say nay. Hearing none, motion passes. The consent calendar for November, the November meeting is approved. Moving on to new business, I believe we have a housing needs analysis, buildable lands inventory in public and semi-public land. Doug.
Correct. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Robin, if you would like to pull up the PowerPoint, please. All right. So this is our ongoing briefings that we've been providing to you on the housing needs analysis, otherwise known as the HNA. This is be your last briefing before the entire package in its final form is brought to you at your meeting in January of 2021. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to walk through is where we're at with our final draft on our buildable lands inventory. And then we're going to talk about the HNA. And then finally, we're going to talk about the public semi-public land analysis. Next. So as we've gone through this process on the HNA, there are some technical requirements that we do have. And so we went back, and as we've shared with you in some prior briefings, we went back and redid the buildable lands inventory. The last time we did that was back in 2018. So it's been a 2-year period. And the consultants, Echo Northwest, went through and we double checked and verified multiple times, properties that were vacant, partially vacant, what was constrained lands, what was developed lands, and so forth. From all of that, then we went through and we recalculated all of the information from, well, currently, based upon what we did in 2019 to see where those differences were as land has developed over the course of the last 2-year period. Next slide. So this is a map that you've seen before. So this is our buildable lands inventory with our vacant, partially vacant, and our constrained lands. And so as you can see, these are broken out by the comprehensive plan designation. So the big green piece that you see kind of up to the north and to the northeast is the Springbrook Properties area. And then the lighter brown is the low density residential. And you can see those are scattered, but those are predominantly around the periphery. There are a few parcels that are interior. Then you can see over on your right-hand side of the screen, you'll see some high density and some medium density land. That's over off of Springbrook Road. And then there's the land that's down off of the bypass, both north and south of the bypass. And at the time we did this entire study, there have been no permits and foundations started for any of the River Run subdivision. So that is currently considered to be vacant. Of course, that has all changed now because we've been issuing permits, but we had to have a cutoff date, and we made that cutoff date October 1st of 2020. Next slide. So this is a table that shows us what we have for buildable acres. So there are 631 buildable acres, and that's both vacant and partially vacant. And then we broke that out so that you can see the vacant parcels, 254 in their acreage, and partially vacant was 377. This is different than what you saw back in 2019. Back at that time, we had 675 buildable acres. We also went back and looked at the Springbrook district just to make sure, because that was based upon the number of units that were in the master plan itself, but there was some additional environmental constraints that came up that we needed to account for. Next slide. So any questions on the BLI? It's pretty straightforward. I think I've shown that to you in draft form a couple of times already. So nothing really has changed since the last briefing on that topic. Okay, then we'll move into the housing needs analysis document itself. Next slide. Per the administrative rule requirements, we were using safe harbor provisions, and the ad hoc committee went through all of that, but we had to update data from 2019 to current data. So we worked through household size, group quarters, vacancy rates, and the housing mix. I should say on the housing mix component, we did not change the percentages that we used in 2019. Then we updated information in the document on housing sales and rent information. And then, of course, median family income did increase over the course of that last 2-year period. So if you had the opportunity to read through the document, you can, and if you really were a policy wonk and compared that to 2019, you can see there's a whole variety of different tables in the document that needed to be updated to reflect the current information that is available. Next slide. The big one, we've talked about this before, is the housing forecast. So this came out at the end of June of 2020. And as I mentioned at our last briefing, over the 20-year period from 2021 to 2041, which is the planning period that we're forecasting for, is that we're actually have a slower growth rate than what was calculated in 2017 by PSU. This is something that has occurred statewide, where it's not unique to just Newberg or to Yamhill County. Communities statewide outside of the Portland metro area, which uses a different methodology to do their forecasting, growth rates were actually smaller. And most of the growth that we do get in Newberg comes from in-migration. And I mentioned last time at our last meeting is that what we're seeing is an aging population and a lower birth rate that's occurring. And so that affects the modeling. In last meeting, I mentioned that PSU uses a cohort model in their methodology. Then, so from that new PSU population information, that directly then ties back into the buildable lands inventory, and we'll get to some of the slides on that a little bit later. Next slide. So then we had to go back and we had to look at group quarters. And predominantly the group quarters are George Fox University. Question came up, is Friendsview considered group quarters? And it is not. When we gave the last presentation to the ad hoc committee, there may be some methodology changes that are coming out in the 2020 census, and there may or could be in the future some aspects of Friendsview that actually would fit into group quarters. And so, so we had to go back to the 2010 census, which had the most recent data that is available. And then we talked with George Fox University about if they were going to be building any new dorms or not, and they are not. So that changed our earlier projections of group quarter population and actually lowered it down. As you can see at the bottom of the slide, it's only 155. Part of that is attributed that Fox does convert some buildings that may be used for one purpose now, but then they convert those and use those for housing for students. We shared with the ad hoc committee that we're assuming 20% of those group quarter populations will require new housing units overall. Next slide. This is a graph that projects housing sales. And so this goes back from 2016 up through August of 2020. In the HNA document, we have some comparison communities that we've used. And so for purposes of this particular graphic, we were comparing Newberg to McMinnville and then to Sherwood, basically communities either immediately to the east of us or off to the southwest of us. And as you can see, we're kind of in between in those prices that are there, but you can see that prices have gone up significantly. Where we were at 340,000 as a median sale price in 2018, that has risen to $430,000. And so that directly, ties into housing affordability issues across the board. Next slide. This one particular slide relates to, what you can afford based upon your median family income. And so if you look at the far left-hand side of this particular graphic, you can see that a household income of $27,600, which is 30% of the median family income, can only afford $690 in rent a month. And then we've tried to categorize that or identify it by what type of jobs could afford that particular rent. And so for that example, fast food workers. And then you go up the scale, 50% of median families, 46,100. Now your rent is up to 1150. Or if you were trying to purchase a home, you could only afford a home of 138 to 161,000. And if you go back to the prior slide, and the median sale price for a house in Newberg today is 430,000. Try to find a $161,000 home in Newberg. I don't believe you'll be able to find it. In the middle is that 80% of median family, and there the income is 73,700, and so that's 80% of 92,100, which is shown over on the left-hand column of the slide. Now you can start to afford a home of 258 to 295, or a rent of about $1,800 a month. The next category up basically kind of gets into the workforce housing side of it, that 100% of median family. So there, the household wage 92,100. You could afford rent of 2,300. Home price is 322 to 368. Again, if you look back at the prior slide, that median house price is 430. So even the housing prices in Newberg, it's a challenge for somebody making 100% of median family income. The 120 there you see is 110,500. Now you can start to afford a house of 387,000 to 442,000. Top end of that is just a little over what the median housing sale price is. And so this is a graphic, and it really kind of gets to the issue of our council goal of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and looking at these income strata and what you can afford for rent, or what you could generally assume that your buying power with the income that you're producing. Next slide. This is another slide just looking at the affordability component of it and looking at in the future for these new households and projecting, how many households would kind of be in each of these particular tiers based upon the percentage of the median family income. And as you can see, we have a lot of families that are in that 80% or less of median family income. we're a little over 60%. And so that becomes a financial challenge to find housing in Newberg. When you start to move to that 80 to 120 or 120 or above, you know, and all of a sudden now you're looking at about roughly 40% of the population can afford that. So, you know, it's what's shown on the right-hand side of this slide basically indicates if you have an income of 105,000, you could afford a median sale price of a house of 430,000. Next slide. This one gets to the population forecast that I mentioned earlier. So in 2041, PSU's projection indicates we would have 33,199 people living in Newberg. That population increase is just a little under 8,000 over that 20-year period. But that's a 32% growth, and that's an average annual growth rate of 1.39. As I mentioned earlier, we have a slower growth rate. And so in 2019 document, it indicated we were going to have an additional 10,819 people. New population says we're going to be just a little over 2,800 fewer individuals than what was projected back in 2018, 2019. Next slide. This table takes our average household size. And so here we've identified that only in the group quarters, another 155 individuals. So if you go back to the previous slide, that change in people are individuals just a little under 8,000. Then we have to deduct out the group quarters component of that. So that gets us to a little over 7,800 at 2.61 people per dwelling unit. That means new occupied dwellings are a little over 3,000. We had to update our vacancy rate. The last document was 5.3%. This one is 5.5. And the 5.5% vacancy equals 165 units. So that gets us a new total number of dwelling units we would need over the 20-year period of 3,169. Where we were at in 2019, the number indicated we were needed to produce about 202 dwelling units per year. Under the new population projection, it's indicating we need 158 new dwelling units per year. Next slide. On this one, I mentioned that we have not changed the percentage of distribution of the housing type. We kept that the same. Same policy consideration that was adopted in 2019. We kept that with this 2020 update. So you can see 60% going forward over that 20-year period of our dwelling units would be detached. 8% would be attached dwelling units. So think of that like townhomes, row houses. And 32% of our new housing stock would be in multifamily units. So again, that gets to that 3,169. Next slide. We had to account for accessory dwelling units. So over the 20-year period, we basically said we get one a year. Doesn't mean we'll get one a year, but over that 20-year period, the total of units totals 20. Then we went back to our downtown improvement plan and looked at the numbers of what we anticipated we were going to get for new multifamily units, and that was 100. So then that leads us to, you know, as the title says, dwelling units requiring vacant or partially vacant land. And so we go back to that percentage distribution. So a little under 1,900 would be dwelling units in single family. Single family attached would be 254, and the multifamily would be 914. We did not change the ADU and the multifamily in the downtown between 2019 and the current document. Next slide. So then we started to allocate these units to the different comprehensive plan designations. So you start with that 1,636 units. And after we've deducted out for the ADUs and for the redevelopment potential. And what you see on this one is that on the percent of units, 16% will occur in low density, 15% in medium density, 20% in medium density, 17% in the high density. And then we had to add in the specific plans. Newberg's a little unique. They have a number of specific plan areas. And so we had to calculate from the vacant, partially vacant land in the Northwest Specific Plan, which is north of Mountain View and to the east of College Street. So that 68 units could occur in that remaining undeveloped, partially undeveloped land. So that's 2% of the total of the housing. And then Springbrook. There we used the exact number that was in the plan itself. So there's identified to be 1,345 dwelling units. So you can see a lot of our dwelling units on the percentage side are really tied into what's going to occur with the Springbrook master plan area at 44%. Next slide. So then we turned and looked at the capacity component of this. And so the consultants went through and calculated our historic density trends. So in our low density, we were at about 4.8, medium was 7.6, and the high density was 18.7. It's really important to note here, this is based upon a gross acres, these units per gross acre. Actually, your densities go up after you deduct out roughly 25% for streets. But that's the way Newberg's code happens to be structured, just based on gross. The Northwest Specific Plan, that's planned at 4.9 dwelling units per acre. So we stayed consistent with that. And then as I already mentioned, the number of units in the Springbrook district. Next slide. I think what's really important on this particular slide is the notes at the bottom dealing with the Springbrook district. And so of that 1,345, we also then looked at it. There's the village residential, which is to the east of Springbrook and north of Crestview Drive. And from that, we were able to extract out that 22 acres of that area would actually be for residential. The balance would be for commercial. And then we had to go through the deduct process about in the low density that's left in Springbrook, what would actually be developable after we deal with these environmentally sensitive areas, and then taking out land for parks that are included in the master plan. And so when you look at those densities I mentioned on the previous slide, and low density of historic trends of 4.8, the Springbrook master plan as it's structured today only has a density of 3.8. So about 1 dwelling unit per acre less than what our historic trend has been. What this slide really indicates, if you peel through it and look at the entire report, is that we need more multifamily land. So if you go back a couple of slides, don't move the slide, Robin, but if you think back a couple of slides and we look at those percentage distributions, that's why we were toggled up in 2019 to have more multifamily land. Next slide, please. So from all of that, we had to run through calculations, and basically what it showed us is we have currently a surplus of low density residential land, about 86 acres. We have a surplus of medium density residential land of about 7 acres, but we have a deficiency of 19 acres of our high density residential land. The bottom graph on this slide is that we then had to account for employment land that occurs within residential areas. And we identify there's about 8 acres in low density, medium density is 9, and high density is 1 acre. We also then, and we'll get to this later in the presentation, looked at the public and semi-public land. And these are, we'll get into it, but it's based upon population, basically people per 1,000. So what it showed us is that we had a need for 46 acres of public and semi-public land in low density, 35.7 in medium, and 23.5 acres in high density. We did not do this public semi-public land analysis or this employment in 2019. This is something that's new. We were going to have to do the public semi-public after the 2019 document was adopted. But when we move forward this time, I made sure that we were rolling those numbers all in so that we could get a much clearer picture of what our land need was. Next slide. What I think the real important part of this particular slide is the far right-hand column. And so what it shows us is we still have a surplus of low density residential of 31 acres, but overall, when we factor in the employment in residential and the public, semi-public, is we have a deficit of 37 acres of medium density and 44 acres of high density. And we wanted to make sure we were sharing it with everybody what it looked like in 2019. In 2019, we had a deficit of 20 acres of low density, 26 of medium density, and 62 of high density. Again, the reason this changed is all driven by the population growth number. Next slide. So now we get into what I've alluded to is the public, semi-public land analysis. Next slide. So we worked internally and I coordinated with our public works department to what our land needs were for elements of public infrastructure. And then we talked with the library about their future needs. And then we looked at the downtown plan. So the aggregate is we need about 15.4 acres of land for future facilities, as outlined here for water. We got some water booster pump stations and wastewater pump stations that we're going to need. We're looking at water treatment plant expansion. The library could have a small expansion on some land to the east of them. And then we have 3 parking lots that we need. And so there's a spreadsheet behind all of this that breaks it down to the acres for each of those categories. Consultants talked with Yamhill County, and the county itself didn't have a land need, but the transit agency did. And so they had a need for some park and ride facility and a transit bus parking facility, and that totaled about 2 acres. And then we talked with the state, and this is all tied with phase 2 of the bypass. And so we looked at the land within our existing urban growth boundary within the corridor that had not yet been acquired by ODOT. And that totaled a little over 11 acres of land. Next slide. Parks. And so this in part was embedded in a previous slide. So when we look at, and this comes directly out of our comprehensive plan, we have a table that mirrors what's in CPRD's Parks Master Plan. And so based upon the types of park and people per thousand, we calculated that we needed additional 60 acres of land for parks. For schools, conversations with the school district is they did not identify any additional land needs over the 20-year time period. And then the semi-public, we looked at churches, and there's some other semi-public categories of uses. And so the churches, there was a need for 28. And again, this is based upon people per thousand. And the same formula is used for the other semi-public at 4 acres. Next slide. We then roll that all together for our estimated land need. And so you can see that residential plan designations, low, medium, and high, commercial, 2.2, the industrial. So this is just a different way of breaking out numbers we already showed you in previous slides. So that came to a total of 120.5 acres for the public, semi-public land need. Next slide. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this briefing is, this is your last briefing on this project. And we gave the committee one last opportunity to read through the entire document and get us any comments back by tomorrow. Then starting next week, we would take any additional comments that we've received and we'll start to prepare the final document. That will come back to you at your meeting in January. There will be a resolution we will be looking for. It's basically a resolution asking council to accept what will be called the 2021 housing needs analysis document. And then we would be on to the city council in February for their review and acceptance of the document. Next slide. And so this one just gives you the dates that I was mentioning. When we do come back to you in January, they will be structured in two pieces of information. One is you will get the housing needs analysis and the policy strategies, and we did not change any of the strategies in that document. We did have to update some tables and so forth. And then your second resolution will be a recommendation to accept the public, semi-public land need analysis. With that, I will stop and see if there are any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions for Doug? Hearing none.
Commissioner Wright,
Oh, go ahead.
in doing this analysis, when we adopted resolution 2020-356 recommending the comprehensive map amendments, does that include the new rezoning in this from the low density and commercial to MDR? And then on the zoning map from the R1 C1 to R2?
Yes, it does. And so we put together the HNA and the buildable lands document side, anticipating that all of the riverfront comp plan and zoning amendments would be adopted, and they were adopted. The ordinance takes effect on December 16th.
Okay. Because I couldn't find if it was adopted or not. Okay. Adopted.
I was going to get to that in the very last part of our meeting tonight.
Okay. Well, you are awesome. You anticipate it all. Thank you very much. That was my question.
Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Doug, how often do we update this? Every 2 years?
No, actually, there's a new methodology and there's a new timeline. And so as part of the middle housing, which we're going to get to next, DLCD adopted some new provisions, and we're going to have to update this every 8 years.
Okay.
Typically, they were updated about every 10 years. So the cycle is going to be a little quicker or shorter in updating this. Now, that does not preclude the city from adopting something earlier. As I mentioned, I think on the previous EOA briefing, we have a small surplus of commercial land, but over the next couple of years, a lot of that commercial land is going to get developed, and primarily it's going to get developed by Crestview Crossing. So a lot of the residential in that project is actually on commercial land that was approved through a conditional use and a PUD process. So we may want to come back and revisit HNA before an 8-year period.
Great, thank you. And then the other item I had was, I read the report and I was real impressed with it. It was really thorough, and I think they've covered all the bases. So.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Okay. If that concludes that part of our night's proceedings, we'll move on to the middle housing report.
Okay. Robin, the next one, please. All right. So this one has a lot of slides in it, but some of them we're going to go through relatively quickly because they're just graphics to give you a representation of different housing types. So this was our last presentation. Go ahead, Robin, go to the next slide. This was the presentation that we provided to the ad hoc middle housing committee. They've met 3 times so far. They had their orientation, and then we've had 2 sessions diving into issues on code audit and types of middle housing concepts that are out there. So as the slide indicates, we did this code audit. We've shared that with them. We got a lot of feedback about parking. Parking is an issue. Planning Commission in the past has talked about parking being an issue. And so there's no resolution yet on that, but it is one that the consultants are clearly aware is a issue in Newberg. We've talked about cottage cluster development, and I'll show you some more slides later on that. And then we had to talk about these master planned area, these specific plans. And so Northwest, Springbrook, Riverfront, Springbrook Oaks, Airport. We have all these different master plans or specific plans that are out there. And so we needed to have a good conversation with the committee on that one. I'll get to the end. We'll also be talking, we're having an open house, a virtual open house next week. So I sent you an email. You're all invited to attend. Next slide. So kind of a recap, middle housing is that a new state law was passed, House Bill 2001, a new administrative rule was passed on duplexes. As of today, I got the email that the Land Conservation and Development Commission adopted the other middle housing. So that is the triplexes, quads, townhomes, and cottage clusters. So our consultants will need to take that into consideration. And we also talked with the committee about when there could be situations where there's conversions. You could take an existing structure and potentially convert it into a duplex or a triplex. And we don't have any provisions in our code for that type of modification to occur.
Oh, that's interesting.
And then we talked about the topic of just, what happens in existing neighborhoods and what happens in new neighborhoods. So, next slide. So our consultants shared with the committee, and what do units look like? If you were to drive around Newberg today, if you identify a duplex unit, a lot of that stuff was built in the 60s and 70s. There has not been much built since that time. And so what you see is a lot of older ranch style homes and so forth in town. But, the industry has changed significantly over 30 years. And there's a lot more detailing that occurs with middle housing design types than what occurred, again, in the past. Next slide. So this is an example of a new and an old. So the old duplex is on your right, the new duplex is on your left. So very different times when they were constructed, different styles. Next slide. This is a corner duplex. Again, a very more modern design look, but there is some articulation in the building. It's more of a flatter roof rather than having a pitched roof. Next slide. This is another corner duplex, or some might call it a townhouse. Again, it's more of a modern design than what you would see, from stuff that was built in the 60s and the 70s. Next slide. This is a detached duplex. And in the new administrative rules, duplexes can be attached or detached. One of the questions that came up to the committee, well, would this be considered an ADU? And no, for Newberg's regulations, an ADU can be no more than 1,000 square feet or more than 50% of the size of the primary residence. So this is truly 2 detached units on one lot. Next slide. Here's a new duplex, but this one, where you've seen some, it doesn't have a driveway in the front. The driveway's in the back. So you have something that's, a softer feel from the street appearance. Next slide. This is a duplex with a garage up front. Again, a different design. It's got gable roofs and shingles, some porch coverings and so forth. Next slide. This is another new duplex, and this one, again, a different design type, but it is attached, but there is some articulation and difference between the 2 units. One's set back a little further than the other unit. Next slide. Then this is an example up in Portland of a row of duplexes. So that's just, again, it's a different product type. Next slide. This is a triplex. Again, you see in this one doesn't have garages up front. Garages could be around the back, or it could be that they're using on-street parking to meet their particular needs. Next slide. Here's another new triplex, but then some might ask, is this a townhouse or a row house? Because there's 3 units attached. Well, there's some definitions now in state law that distinguish between what's row houses and what's a triplex in this case. A triplex would be 3 units built on one lot. A row house would be 1 unit on each lot, but it's got common walls. Next slide. Another example of a triplex. One does not have parking up front and the other does have parking up front. Next slide. Here's quad. So it almost kind of looks like, you know, 2 duplexes attached kind of concept. But again, you don't see parking in the front. Parking is accommodated either at the rear or they could be using on-street parking. Next slide. Here's a newer version of a quad. And this one is, again, a more modern design. But again, you don't see parking. Next slide. Another idea or an example of a quad. And this one is, again, a more modern design. Next slide. Here is what was identified as a 2-unit townhouse. So each of these units are actually on a separate lot with just a common wall between the two. And that's the distinction between a duplex. Somebody might look at it and say, well, that's a duplex. If you go through the records, it would show that those are 2 separate parcels. Next slide. This is an example of a 3-unit townhouse. Again, so each one of these would be on its own separate lot. And this is something that's more urban, more downtown kind of concept. Next slide. This is a 6-unit townhouse. And again, there's lots of different variations on how these can be done. Again, on this one, you don't see garages necessarily up front, but you see garages kind of tucked over on the side in this particular graphic. Next slide. This is just a plan view of a townhouse project. As you can see, you know, on the bottom of the drawing would be the front and the entrances. No, excuse me. To the top is the front. And you can see that a couple of the units on the left-hand side have a garage leading into it. On the right-hand side, you got a garage that comes off of a side street. And then the 2 units in the middle do not have a garage. Next slide. This is a 5-unit townhouse. And all of the garages in this example are all interior. They're on the back side of the units. Next slide. This is just the opposite. Here's a townhouse project where it has driveways all up front. So you can see you get different feel, curbside feel from the different product types that are available. Next slide. Cottages. So think of cottages as smaller units that are on one parcel of land. They are not on individual lots, and they have common space area that's shared amongst the different units. Now you kind of see these are more kind of like a craftsman design approach. But you know, as you add all of this different articulation and material and so forth, the committee was talking about, well, that increases the cost. Is that really then becoming an affordable unit or not? This particular developer went with this approach. And so it's probably a little higher price unit. Sometimes you can see these and they're done as a condominium. Sometimes they're developed and they're for rent. It depends on what the developer's looking at. Next slide. Here's another example of a cottage development. And this one, you can see it's the common space would be on your left-hand side of the slide, but you've got your walkways. These are a little simpler designed than the previous slide. Next slide. Here is a plan view of a cottage development. And in this one, it's different because you actually have a parking fields to support this housing product. You can see the lawn area in the middle, and there's a garden area, and that's the common space. But there are no garages attached to these particular units. So you basically have a parking field like you would find in an apartment project. Next slide. This is a little bit different approach. And this probably doesn't follow the current administrative rule that was being adopted today. I haven't read the final rule, but you can see towards the bottom of your slide, you've got the common area between the units. You've got separate parking fields for the units, but the units that are on your right and at the top of the slide do not have a common area, that kind of courtyard common area. Next slide. This is a completely different product type. And again, we don't know if this would actually meet the new administrative rule, but this is a cottage development that's on fee simple ownership lots, which has a variety of open space tracks. And on the right, you can see that the garages are all loaded off of an alley. And that's on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, it would be a similar design. And the common area would be further to the right in the green space area. Next slide, please. So what we shared with the committee is there's a wide range of architectural styles for duplexes, tris, quads, cottages, and townhomes that are out there. Scale of the units vary and depends upon what the developer is looking to do. The number of bedrooms then drives the size of the particular unit. Each of these different concepts has some different parking impacts, and there's different ways to address how you provide parking. And as I kind of noticed with going through this presentation is sometimes you can look at these units and you can't tell if it's a duplex or a townhome or a triplex or a townhome or a quad or a townhome. It's pretty clear between on the cottages. The cottages are individual units. Next slide. So the question came up, you know, how much or how many of these middle housing types might we see in Newberg? So the consultants came up with some background information. We kind of looked at it to the city of Portland and what has happened with ADUs. So next slide. So Portland has been allowing ADUs for a number of years. And so the consultants pulled information that the city of Portland has. And you can see they weren't doing a whole bunch of ADUs until you got to 2010. And then they started modifying their regulations. By the time we got to 2014, 2015, they did further modifications to the regulations. And you can see that there was a big increase that was occurring in accessory dwelling units. Next slide. And so we shared with the committee, you know, from that ADU perspective in Portland, which is not always a good example to more rural communities, but you can see that a lot of these ADUs are happening on the inner east side of Portland or up in northeast Portland, basically where the land is flatter. You don't see a lot when you get over into the West Hills or out into Southwest Portland. Next slide. And so what we were trying to show the committee is that just because you have middle housing doesn't mean it's just going to be, that's what all the developers are going to do. There's still going to be, developers are going to be doing detached single family homes. There will be some who will want to enter into this market niche and address the issue about duplexes and tris and row houses and so forth. For purposes of Portland, when we looked at it, you know, that was about 1% of the new housing was actually ADUs. I have subsequently shared with our consultants the number of ADUs that we've had based upon data that I was able to collect out of our files over the last 5 years or so. And again, we haven't done a whole bunch of ADUs. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we haven't seen much in the way of duplexes or triplexes or quads over the course of the last 20 or 30 years. Next slide, please. So Echo Northwest had a contract with the DLCD when they were putting together these middle housing provisions and looking at, you know, what makes it cost effective or feasible to do. And so this is a little bit of a complicated graph. I think the real area to focus on is the rectangular box at the top. And this was an example on triplexes. And what it shows, in order for it to be a marketable component that a developer would look at, is that you got to start to look down below. So like if you take the first triangle at the top that's above that top line, you start to look at that, and it deals with parking. They've got 2 spaces. It's on a 5,000 square foot lot. You can start to get, it makes it a little more cost effective or feasible to develop if you got triplexes and you're on a 7,500 square foot lot. In the same situation, if you're trying to do a triplex on a 10,000 square foot lot, it gets less return, I guess is the best way to say that, is where you see that the stars that are in blue. And so they kind of put this together as it's cool, a warm, or a hot market, and where would developers go? And it's kind of all over the board. Again, each community is going to be different. So I wouldn't take this as this is what's going to happen in Newberg, but this is an example of what might happen in Newberg. Next slide. On this one, they looked at fourplexes, so that's a similar type of methodology. Next slide. As part of the administrative rule, and I don't want to exactly read this, but no more than 3% increase in residential density capacity can be assumed to result from middle housing in existing UGVs. And then the consultants looked at Minneapolis, who just did some provisions about triplexes. And in their first year, they only received 3 applications. And if anybody's tracked what's going on in Minneapolis, they've kind of, we're the leader. We're getting rid of single family zoning to try to create a way to provide more affordable housing units. And they did these provisions on triplexes in the first year. They not have a big response. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, single family is still going to be the predominant housing type that would get built, we believe. This middle housing is going to be possible in some specific areas. But again, we're looking, maybe a 1 to 3% of our housing stock is going to fit into this middle housing in the future. Now, there's another component to this is, and I mentioned this in an earlier middle housing briefing, there's an infrastructure-based time extension request, and the council approved that at their meeting on Monday night. And there's an area, we looked at 2 areas, an area north of downtown and an area south of downtown. And in that, we were looking at infrastructure issues, so transportation, sewer, water, and storm. And we found that we did not have transportation, wastewater, or stormwater issues in those 2 areas. And those are 2 of the older areas of town where we knew we likely had infrastructure deficiencies to accommodate additional density. What we did find in the north areas, we had 1 place on Vermilion where we have a water line project that would need to occur. And in the south area, we had 8 projects identified to accommodate middle housing. And the cost for that water infrastructure is about $6.2 million. And we plugged that into our capital improvement model and identified it would take us out until fiscal year 28-29 to do those water line projects to accommodate additional middle housing. Now, outside of those 2 areas, any place that's zoned R1, R2, R3, or RP, every place has to allow middle housing. Then we'll be able to look at selectively what other areas in Newberg might we want to have triplexes, quads, cottage clusters, and townhouses. Next slide. I like this slide from Elizabeth. It's got a good graphic. in order to accommodate middle housing, it's a team approach, and there's lots of things that we need to look at. When you get into triplexes and quads, you start to meet commercial building code requirements. And so the building codes division is looking at that. SDCs always become a topic of discussion. What public improvements, capital improvements, does a city or a city have planned? Financing, and we don't control any of that, but developers going to lending institutions to get the financing to do this middle housing product. And then there's always the consumer on the backside. You know, what do they want? You might, if you go back into the HNA document, there's a graphic in there that kind of shows the life cycle of home ownership. So you might start off in an apartment, and then you might move into a small house, and then you might move into a bigger house. And then as you age, you kind of go back to a smaller house, and then you might go into more of a care facility. And so there is a life cycle of the types of housing we need based upon where we're at in our age and our life cycle. Next slide. So we've asked the committee about code updates. And so we've gotten a lot of good feedback. We heard information about affordability. We heard information about our minority populations and the costs. And it's very costly to live in Newberg. And we went through that in the HNA side. There's all that data there. Unit sizes depends upon on your family. You know, some people are looking for a 2-bedroom unit. Some people want a 4 or 5-bedroom unit. We know that we're going to have to pull out because our triplex and quad provisions are actually woven now into our multifamily. And so we're going to have to pull that out and do a separate section in our regulations for those. We're going to have to make some revisions to our townhouse requirements. And we have no requirements at all for cottage clusters. So this will be something that will be very new. And then we talked a bit about conversions as well. And so I brought that up very early in the presentation about what if somebody wants to take a single family home and convert it into a duplex? How does that work? They would do it to a triplex. It has a different set of potential issues associated with it. Next slide. Parking. So there are limitations within the administrative rule on what we can require for parking. For duplexes, we can require 1 space per duplex. So that you end up with 2 spaces on site. That brought up a big conversation amongst the committee about, well, now the people are parking on the street. So it's that age-old issue of the parking space that's in front of my house is my private parking space. It's actually not. It's a public space. It's part of the public right-of-way. Anybody can park in the public street. Yes, we have time limitations of how long you can be there, generally 72 hours. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done on parking for all of this middle housing types. Next slide. The question came up at the last committee meeting about, well, if Newberg, and they used the example of a duplex, if we could only require 2 off-street parking space for that duplex, does that mean a developer could provide more parking if they wanted to? Yes, they could. So a developer could choose to do a duplex and have a double car garage, or have a duplex with a single car garage and a space in front of that parking garage. But we are limited on duplexes. We can only require 2 off-street parking spaces. Next slide. So we had a series of slides on parking because it was a big topic. We talked a bit about, you know, what we're doing today, or development patterns happening today may not be what happens in 20, 30, 40, or 50 years. You know, we always hear about, you know, autonomous vehicles and you don't need it. You know, Uber and Lyft are out there now. No, we're not talking about putting parking meters in residential areas and charging. That's not the intent of that slide. But it's just something we need to think about is, you know, what we know today, the future may be different. We also had some conversations about parking management tools, and this really was focused around the area around the university where we have college students. So if you're getting middle housing or you're getting home conversions and you got this parking demand increase, there are some communities who have residential parking districts and you have to, get a permit or buy a permit, and that gives you the ability to have a space on the street. Again, we're not there. Newberg's not at that point, I don't believe, but there are tools that are out there in order to help manage your on-street parking situations. Next slide. So we asked these questions in the discussion. Again, there's no definitive answer to these, but what will be our minimums for these different styles of middle housing? What are those impacts going to be? There are provisions in the administrative rule about townhouses and lot size. And there are certain design elements that we can do. And then there's other design elements we cannot do. The developer could choose to do them. So for townhouses, we can only pull from the list of 5. We could do none, we could do 1, or we could do all 5, but we can't do more than that. For the cottage cluster, back in the slides I was showing, there's some flexibility there. Again, the committee is going to have to work through that and what it's going to look like. Next slide. So this where we got a little deeper into the cottage cluster. So they're going to have to be allowed in R1, R2, R3, and our RP district. The footprint of a cottage can be 900 square feet. That's the max. But the building envelope itself could be from 900 to 1800. So essentially you could have a 2-story cottage. Clusters can be 5 to 8 units, or we could consider something greater. The committee talked a little bit about, well, maybe up to 10 or 12. The minimum lot size, 7,000 square feet. We've got to have that common open space. And there's a minimum of 1 parking space per unit. So it's kind of prescriptive. And again, this is all new. So not a lot of cottage cluster development has happened in the state of Oregon. And with the new administrative rule, we'll see how that works out. Next slide. These are just some examples, again, of cottage clusters. So this is one where you have the courtyard. You've got a field of parking over on the left-hand side. And this one, cottages must be about the courtyard area. And I believe we talked about the courtyard area has to be a minimum, I think it was 500 square feet. I think I'd have to go back and double check. So there is, again, it's pretty prescriptive. Next slide. I've already showed you this one, but this is an example of, what a cottage cluster development might look like. Committee members asked, could these be condos? Yes, theoretically they could. Depends upon if the developer wanted to do that or not. But that minimum lot size would be 7,000 square feet. So when we're talking about the number of cottages that could happen in that range is really driven by the lot size. And so how many cottages could you get on a 7,000 square foot lot? If you had a 10 or 12,000 square foot lot, you're going to be able to get more cottages. Next slide. And again, this one you've already seen, but this is this other example of kind of fee simple ownership of cottages. Again, we're not sure that this particular example, I think this was done by Hayden Homes, would actually meet the administrative rule that was going through review and adoption today. Next slide. And then so we had some discussion. And again, there was no explicit conclusion. There was a question asking about, could you do cottages in a subdivision? If so, then we'd have to create a separate section in our subdivision, our land division regulations for cottages. Talked about orientation. And again, it always comes back to parking. Some members ask, can you have a garage with a cottage? If a developer wanted to do that, yes, they could have an attached garage. Next slide. So then we moved on and talked about the master plan areas. And so as I mentioned earlier, Springbrook, the airport residential, Northwest Springbrook Oaks, and the riverfront. Next slide. So Springbrook District is up on the north, so it's off of Mountain View and over by Crestview Drive and Zimmery and Aspen Way. Next slide. Airport Residential is over onto the east side of Sportsman's Air Park. I can say now is that the airport residential area is now fully developed. And so it's really not an issue. That might be more of one is what about a conversion might happen, but all of that area has been developed out. Next slide. Springbrook Oaks is on the right-hand side. This area, and so this is over off of north of Fernwood, north and south of Hayes, and then to the east of Springbrook Road. This area is almost entirely developed at this point. We just did approval for a land use application for Springbrook Communities Phase 2. So that's just north of Springbrook Communities Phase 1 over off of Providence. And then there's some land that the PCC owns, but that's really for expansion of the Newberg campus in the future. So this area is, again, is pretty well built out for residential. But in the future, because of the way the administrative rule is written, is that if somebody wanted to tear down a house and put in a duplex, we would have to allow it. So this could lead to, we're going to may have to come back and do some amendments to these various specific plans. The one on your left is the Northwest specific plan. And so in the EOA, I think we identified there were 68 or 69 units that could go in there. And where you see up on the top right-hand side where it says OS, that's predominantly the land that's undeveloped in the Northwest specific plan. There are a couple of parcels interior that have not redeveloped yet. Next slide. And then we had the riverfront. And so this came up. If we factored that into the HNA work, yes, we did. So the lighter yellow is the medium density. The darker yellow is the high density residential. And those are areas that could be developed. A lot of the stuff just south of 9th Street is already developed. If you're on the far left-hand side over off of Charles Street, a lot of that is already developed duplexes. And then on the top right of the riverfront area, there's a parcel that has been undeveloped that could be for medium density residential. Next slide, please. So I mentioned this a couple of times, is that in all of these master plan areas, we're going to have to require, it's required to permit duplexes on every lot. There may be other middle housing types. And we're still trying to glean through. We've asked some questions of DLCD about provision in the administrative rule about initial time of construction and what does that specifically mean. And so we're working on that. So I can't give you a definitive answer yet. Next slide. And so we had some discussion about that, and it really kind of circled back to, well, what if somebody bought a house and demolished it somewhere in the future? Could they build a duplex? Yes. The regulations would require that to occur. The other middle housing types, again, we have the ability to identify what areas within Newberg that are zoned for single family that could accommodate triplexes, quads, and row houses. Next slide. Then we talked about some design review components of this. And right now we've got this kind of eclectic mix because our triplexes and quads require a type 2 review process. That's going to change. We're looking at the issue about stream corridors. We have some provisions. You can't build within the stream corridor, but if you have an existing structure, you can do a limited expansion, and there's a numeric number in our code. So what if you had somebody who had a house that was partially in a stream corridor, they wanted to add onto that house and turn it into a duplex, could they do that? And so we're going to have to go back and look at our stream corridor regulations. And then we also looked at alleys. And so our alley access provisions are a little bit, well, I'll call wonky. So we're going to have to go back and look at those as well. So if somebody wanted to do, a triplex and off of an alley, we're going to have to look at our standards and make sure that that would be feasible to do. Next slide. So again, we had some discussion about that. More to come as we go through the process. Next slide. So open house, December 15th from 6 to 8. So our consultants will be leading this conversation. So they're going to basically give a presentation talking about each of these middle housing types, and then we'll stop and allow for a Q&A process. So if you have nothing to do next week and you would like to engage in a virtual open house on Zoom, you're more than welcome to do that. As a reminder, is that we have to have the duplex provisions in place by June 30th of 2021. For the other middle housing, we will be bringing that material back to the Planning Commission and the City Council in the fall of 2021. We have to have it completed by the end of June of 2022. And that's all I have. Questions?
Okay. Any questions for Doug?
On Planning Commissioner, Chris Wright, on the currently our codes are limited to 2 stories vertical. So a lot are you going to so I assume that some of these triplexes or with a ground floor with a garage parking, will that be considered another floor?
We have to look at that, Commissioner. We're not sure. That question has come up in our meetings with the ad hoc committee about structure height. And we just don't have the answer to that yet. If you were in an R1 zone today, you're limited to 35 feet. So the question would be, do you want to go to, and that is measured half the distance between basically the gutter line and the ridge line on the roof. And then there are other provisions, and we use the methodology out of the Uniform Building Code to do structure height calculations. So it's on the list, but I don't have a definitive answer of what that solution might be.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much for that update. I think we're all much better informed now. Moving on, we have items from staff.
So, as I had mentioned, is that, well, a couple of things. So the Riverfront Master Plan, the comp plan zone change, development code regulations, and so forth was adopted by City Council. And that was on November 16th, and that ordinance goes into effect on December 16th. As I mentioned earlier, the infrastructure-based time extension request went to council on Monday night. They did approve that. We have until the end of December in order to submit that material. I do have some questions out to DLCD because there's some references to a section in the administrative rule that doesn't exist. So we're trying to figure out what are we supposed to do?
Whoops.
Yeah. So those are those 2 things on your forward calendar. Looking at it, so at your January meeting, we will have a legislative hearing on the transportation system plan, and that will be to implement the riverfront provisions. The population forecast has come out. Well, I mentioned it because we used it for the HNA and the EOA document, actually. So we need to officially put that into our comprehensive plan, and we use the new forecast to do all of our modeling and analysis work. But we need to get that in the code, so that'll be another legislative hearing. And then we have the housing needs analysis, buildable lands, population recommendation that we talked about, this public, semi-public land. And then I'll be able to give you another briefing on where we're at with the middle housing. Hopefully I don't bore you to death with middle housing, but it's kind of a big deal. It's a change, and I'm assuming that members of the community are going to be concerned about, well, that vacant lot next to me, is it going to be a duplex in the future? Theoretically, it could be, if that property owner or developer wanted to build that housing type. So I'll keep giving you briefings as we move forward with all of that. With that, Mr. Chair, I'm done.
Okay. Any items from commissioners?
No. Not yet.
Okay. Do we have to talk about positions rotating in and out at the end of the year? I believe some people are leaving us and that sort of thing.
Yes, I had that as a note on my agenda, handwritten note.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Ficker, it is his last meeting. He will be transitioning out. So, Bob, it's been fun. I appreciate your time.
3 years, Doug. You guys will carry on without me, I'm sure.
Well, we'll do something.
Okay.
So, city recorder is out working on recruitment to fill a variety of positions on different committees, standing commissions or committees that we have. So if you know of somebody who's interested, let Sue know. I believe she sent you out some information. If you know somebody, let her know.
Okay. Well, I guess that'll do it then. I'll say goodbye to Bob too. It's
I'll see you sometime, Jason.
I'm sure you will. Okay, and if there's nothing else, anybody has anything, speak up. Okay, we'll adjourn it. Go ahead, good.
I just wanted to say also, thank you, Mr. Ficker. You've been wonderful to have present at meetings and watch how you deal with things. And thank you for your time in this committee. It's appreciated.
Absolutely. Okay, and if there's nothing more, we will adjourn, and I will wish all of you a Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Merry
Happy
Christmas.
holidays.
Merry Christmas.
Holidays.
Merry Christmas, everyone.